What if there was a densely populated poor neighborhood a few hundred yards from your home? Would you be able to sleep peacefully every night? This is an aerial photo taken in a country. This photo symbolizes the all too harsh reality that this country is facing. What is the economic disparity beyond imagination? What is the end result of a country with too much disparity? Let's take a look at the harsh reality of the most unequal country on earth. Hello everyone, my name is Kanta. Do you know the top 5 countries in the world with the most severe wealth disparity? One measure of disparity is called the Gini coefficient. The Gini coefficient is a measure of income inequality in a single country. The Gini coefficient is expressed between 0 and 1, ranging from 0 in a perfectly equal society to 1 in a perfectly unequal society. In other words, a number closer to 0 means a society where disparity does not exist, while a number closer to 1 means a society where disparity is severe. Here is the Gini coefficient data from the World Bank. The Gini coefficient is expressed as a percentage, so the number divided by 100 is the Gini coefficient, and South Africa is number 1 at 0.63, followed by Namibia at 0.59, Zambia at 0.57, Central African Republic at 0.56, and Eswatini at 0.54. Eswatini, by the way, is the country formerly known as Swaziland. Most of the countries may be unfamiliar to you, but they are all African countries. In Japan, where I live, people sometimes say that inequality is serious. But when we look at the Gini coefficient, the figure is 0.32. Generally speaking, a Gini coefficient between 0.3 and 0.4 is a favorable situation from the perspective of economic growth, because although inequality does exist, the principle of competition is also at work. Even in the US, which is known as a hypergap society, the Gini coefficient is a little over 0.4. You can see why South Africa is an anomaly, with a Gini coefficient of 0.63, one of the worst in the world. Yes, the theme this time is the Republic of South Africa, a country located at the southernmost tip of the African continent. While South Africa is known for its beautiful landscapes and diverse culture, there are serious inequalities in the country, with some even saying that there is no country on earth as unequal as South Africa. As will be explained later, South Africa achieved democratization in 1994, but rather than narrowing the gap widened after 1994 when the country became a democracy. A problem in South Africa is the economic disparity between races. South Africa is home to a wide variety of ethnic groups, including blacks, whites, and people of Indian and Asian descent. But a particular problem is the large disparity between blacks and whites. Economically, the richest 10% of the population, which is primarily white, monopolizes about 70% of the country's wealth. As for the unemployment rate for whites is less than 7%, but for blacks, the unemployment rate exceeds 30%, meaning that approximately 1 out of 3 blacks is out of work. The aerial photograph shown at the beginning of the video also symbolizes exactly the economic disparity between blacks and whites. The area on the left side of the photo, with its simple and narrow houses, is densely populated with mostly black residents, while the beautiful residential area on the right side is dominated by mostly white residents. Despite the so-called affirmative action, which allows the majority of blacks, who make up about 80% of the population, to receive preferential treatment in education and employment, there remains a serious reality of racial economic disparity in South Africa against the backdrop of economic inequality between blacks and whites. Why does such a large disparity exist between blacks and whites? To consider the background, we need to look at the history of South Africa. Approximately 400 years ago, in 1652, it was the Dutch who first arrived in what is now South Africa. The Dutch built Cape Town at the southernmost tip of Africa and made it a base for the Dutch who traded with Asian countries for water and food supplies. Originally, African natives lived there, but the Dutch, using strong military force, took the land from the Africans one after another. The descendants of the Dutch who came to South Africa during this period became known as Afrikaners, who spoke Afrikaans, a language derived from Dutch. However, there were other countries that wanted South Africa, which was rich in natural resources and would be an important hub for trade with Asia. For example, the United Kingdom. In the 19th century, the British took Cape Town from the Dutch, and when more natural resources such as diamonds and gold were found in the area, they went to war with the Afrikaners, descendants of the Dutch who first came to the area and eventually won and took the colony. At the beginning of the 20th century, the Union of South Africa was established in 1910 as an autonomous British territory. In this way, there was once a war between the Dutch and the British over land in South Africa, and many Afrikaners still have a bad impression of the British. From the perspective of the African people who originally lived there, whether Dutch or British, neither may make a good impression. However, even though the Afrikaners and the British do not get along, both are white-skinned people. Both were long-reigning white ruling classes within the country of South Africa. What emerged from this process was the famous South African policy of racial segregation known as apartheid. Apartheid, which means separation in Afrikaans, was an official racist policy that existed in South Africa from 1948 to 1994. Apartheid imposed strict racial segregation between blacks and people of color and whites. Public places, residential areas, schools, hospitals, and other facilities were divided based on race, and interracial marriages and interactions also were restricted. Blacks, in particular, were forced to live in residential areas called townships, which limited their access to education and medical care, as well as their political voice. If black people participated in anti-apartheid movements, they were mercilessly arrested, and many activists were brutally murdered by white police officers in prison. It is unthinkable today, but there was a racist policy in place with impunity, in which every aspect of life was determined by the color of one's skin. Apartheid was widely criticized both nationally and internationally, and an anti-racism movement grew. Apartheid lasted for nearly 50 years, but the end of the Cold War in 1989 marked a turning point in the abolition of apartheid. For about 50 years after World War II, the conflict known as the Cold War continued between capitalist forces led by the United States and communist forces led by the Soviet Union, but the end of the Cold War was declared at the Malta Conference in 1989. During the Cold War, the white South African regime unilaterally decided that the ANC, the African National Congress, a black liberation organization led by Nelson Mandela, was a pawn of communist forces. But with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, such reasoning no longer held true. In 1989, South African leader President de Klerk announced a reform agenda, beginning a movement toward black political participation and the protection of human rights. Furthermore, in 1990, Nelson Mandela, who had been imprisoned for 27 years, was released, searching for dialogue and reconciliation. Then, in 1994, the first democratic elections involving all races were held, and Nelson Mandela was elected president. This marked the end of nearly 50 years of apartheid and the beginning of a new era of democracy in South Africa. With the election of Nelson Mandela as president, South Africa achieved democracy. We would like to say this story has a happy ending. But this upset the white South Africans who had ruled the country until then. In South Africa, about 80% of the population is black, and if we consider only the number of people, whites are in the minority. It was feared that retaliation against the whites, who had once reigned as rulers, would begin by the blacks, who were by far the majority in terms of population. However, newly elected President Nelson Mandela insisted on forgiveness, not retribution. Nelson Mandela said this at his presidential inauguration on May 10, 1994, the day after the election. "We shall build a society in which all South Africans, both black and white, will be able to walk tall without any fear in their hearts, assured of the inalienable right to human dignity, a rainbow nation at peace with itself and the world." Nelson Mandela called on the nation to strive for a new South Africa based on forgiveness and reconciliation, not retaliation and hatred. War is a cycle of hatred that continues. That is why wars will never cease unless someone, somewhere, has the courage to forgive. Nelson Mandela may have thought in this way. One might think that with Nelson Mandela as president, reconciliation between blacks and whites has progressed and the economic gap has disappeared. But as I lightly mentioned earlier, the economic gap in South Africa has not narrowed since 1994, when the country became a democracy. For example, in 2000, South Africa's Gini coefficient was 0.57, but by 2014 it had risen to 0.63. The racial economic disparity between blacks and whites is also still severe. Since the abolition of apartheid, blacks are no longer legally required to live in townships, but blacks still live densely in townships due to economic poverty. In the aerial photo shown here earlier, there are areas where blacks live densely on the left and whites live on the right. And in some places, the residential areas are clearly divided by race. This photo also symbolizes the economic disparity in South Africa. In the back of the photo, there is a concentration of luxury condominiums and office buildings where mainly wealthy white people live, while in the foreground, there is a cluster of small, simple houses where economically poor people, mainly blacks, live. This picture is a true representation of the economic disparity in South Africa. Various reasons have been pointed out for the seriousness of the racial economic disparity in South Africa, but the first to be mentioned is apartheid, which has been explained so far. Apartheid, which has been the official policy for nearly 50 years, and the structure of the country created by it, will not change so easily. Going further back in time, the blacks who originally lived there, since the arrival of the Dutch in 1652, have been dominated by the whites, the Dutch and the English for nearly 400 years. Particularly problematic is the amount of land held. Colonial rule and apartheid not only deprived blacks of their land, but also restricted them from owning it. Because of this, 70% of all farmland is still owned by whites, who make up only 8% of the population. This land issue between whites and blacks has been identified as a major reason why the racial economic gap still has not narrowed. Against this backdrop of the world's worst level of economic disparity, Johannesburg and Cape Town in South Africa are among the world's worst cities for security. More than 20,000 people a year die as a result of homicide, or an average of 57 people a day, or one person is killed every 30 minutes. Furthermore, crimes such as robberies and thefts are frequent, and even the head of the police force has stated that there is no war in South Africa. It is peacetime, but the situation is like a war zone. South Africa has the most serious inequality in the world, and as mentioned earlier, the top ranking of the Gini coefficient, an indicator of inequality, is mostly dominated by African countries. Africa is the continent with the most serious inequality in the world, and one report that is emblematic of the very inequality in Africa made headlines. A Tale of Two Continents, a report published by the UK-based organization Oxfam, found that the wealth of the top 3 richest people on the African continent exceeds the combined wealth of about 650 million poor people, about half of the continent's total population. For example, in the country of Eswatini in southern Africa, the estimated assets of a millionaire are about $4.9 billion. They found that it would take approximately 5.7 million years to acquire this asset if they continued to work in the restaurants of the business partners of the companies owned by this millionaire. Many African countries were colonized by European countries from the late 19th to the mid-20th centuries. The borders of Africa were originally drawn by Europeans during their colonial rule, using paper and rulers to draw lines on a map, and the distribution of ethnic groups was ignored. Therefore, even within a single country, dozens to hundreds of ethnic groups live together, and language and culture may differ among them. Against this background, when one ethnic group comes to power, politics is conducted in favor of their own ethnic group, and other ethnic groups cannot benefit from the politics. This is one of the reasons for the spectacular disparity in Africa. Much of the information about Africa that comes through the media is about poverty. This may be the reason why many people associate the word Africa with the image of poverty. It is true that there are many people living in Africa who are much poorer than we are. On the other hand, there are also wealthy people whose assets are hundreds, thousands, or even tens of thousands of times richer than ours. And the reality is that the gap between the rich and poor is widening to unimaginable proportions. So why has the disparity on the African continent widened so much? Of course, there are many circumstances, and it is impossible to explain in general why the gap has widened in Africa, but I will try to explain it in another video in the near future. The content may be quite difficult to understand, but I will do my best to explain it as clearly as possible. If you have not subscribed to my channel yet, please do so and wait for the next video. My channel provides easy to understand explanations of world issues that are difficult to learn about through other channels. It is important not just to be interested, but to keep interested. If you have not yet subscribed to my channel, please do so and let's continue to learn together with me. If you found this video informative, please support me by clicking the like button. Thank you for watching this video until the end. See you again in the next video.